Good evening. It is good to see you. We're going to be back in 2 Samuel chapter 15 tonight. 2 Samuel chapter 15. I told you we're kind of moving a little bit faster, not warp speed, but a little bit faster. There are some things in each chapter that we're going to pass by. We're not going to be able to talk about them. So if there's something that's on your mind, then let me know, and we'll certainly try to get into that. But I think we have enough just in the first part of 2 Samuel 15 tonight to kind of take up our time. So remember, we're talking about Absalom and King David and how Absalom has been kind of banished, and then he has returned home, at least home back to the vicinity. We ended last week talking about what Absalom did to get attention so he could go see the king. And what was it that Absalom did to get the attention of the folks, Joab particularly, so he could get an audience with the king? What did he do? Yeah, he torched the field. He set the field on fire. And of course, that did get everybody's attention, and that did allow him to find his way to the king. And it says in verse 33 of chapter 14, "So when Joab came to the king and told him, he called for Absalom. Thus he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom." It appears that we're going to get things put back together. And wouldn't that be wonderful? Because if you'll remember in our discussion last week, we talked about some of the passages that indicate to us how upset King David was because of the relationship that he had with Absalom, the way things had just fallen apart. And it hurt him, and he wanted to fix it, but he really didn't know how to fix it. And even when he tried to fix it, kind of made a half-hearted attempt to put it all together. And so it looks like at the end of chapter 14 that everything's going to get back the way it ought to be. And so with that, we'll ask Joey to lead us in prayer, and we'll begin our class.
Heavenly Father, we count it as an honor to be here, to study a portion of the Word, to sing songs of praise to your name, and to encourage one another. We pray as we enter into this study, Father, that we'll have a great recollection of things that He's prepared. He will present it to us in a way that we can understand, and if need be, apply to our life and make changes as we should. We ask all these things in your Son's name.
Amen. We like reconciliation stories. All of us do, whether we'll admit it or not. They don't have to be romantic to be reconciliatory, but nonetheless, we kind of like that. The idea of folks that are in some way estranged, they're not really as close as they ought to be. Things aren't as good with them as they should be, but through some sort of arrangement where one tries to do this, the other responds, eventually people get back together the way they ought to be. We like that sort of thing. In fact, we ought to like that sort of thing because there is a reconciliation theme in God's Word, isn't there? And what is that? What is the great reconciliation of God's Word?
Well, it starts in Genesis 3.
Okay, we're separated from Him. Sin separates us from God. And as the Apostle Paul talked about to the Ephesians, we're reconciled through Christ. And so we're brought back into a good relationship with our Creator through the blood of Jesus and our response to it. We understand reconciliation. We like it. We need it. And we pursue it, at least if we're thinking right. We pursue it. We want to, as much as it depends upon us, the Apostle Paul said in Romans 12, be at peace with all men. We want reconciliation. If we're not wanting it with someone that we need it with, then we need to check our thinking. We understand that. And so when we get to the end of chapter 14 and we read that Absalom goes and prostrates himself before the king, he bows before the king, he subjects himself to the king, which is a very significant thing for Absalom to do in this process. The king responds. And we end chapter 14 thinking, oh yeah, we're getting back to where we need to be. And maybe the situation with David's family can settle down a little bit. But as you know, it is not so. We read just a little bit into chapter 15, and we begin to see what Absalom is doing. He is not there for reconciliation. He is not there to bring the family back together. That's not what he's after. Verse 1 of chapter 15 of 2 Samuel. Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses, and 50 men as runners before him. Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate, and when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say, verse 3, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice. And when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. In this manner, Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel." We see him come back to the king, and then we see why he came back. And he came back to undermine his father, David. And apparently he was really good at it. And apparently he was really devoted to the cause. If you look at what it says there in verse 2, Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. He gets himself up and he gets out there because he's got work to do. He is motivated and he is ambitious and he's going to get it done. And we can look at that and say, okay, there's some good there. But what I wonder when I read through this, before we get into some of the lessons about Absalom and his attitude, what I wonder is how much good could have been accomplished with that kind of dedication, that kind of, stick-to-itiveness, that kind of desire to succeed. How much good could have been done by that? You ever think about that? How there are folks who have a fire within them to get things done, to be productive, and they will pay the price, whatever it is, they are willing to pay it because they want to be successful. And when a person like that, and not everybody has that same level of intensity about them, when a person like that turns their attention to the Lord and his cause, the good that can be accomplished is just amazing. Can you think of a New Testament character like that? The Apostle Paul is like that, yeah. He served the Lord after his conversion with the same passion that he persecuted the Lord and his people. He was that kind of person. Did he get the work done? Absolutely he did. And so I think about what Absalom could have accomplished with that kind of an attitude and that kind of energy, that kind of intellect even, to see the situation and to understand how he could get what he wants. I mean, he had it thought through. He did not just walk out there and say, I'll just see how this goes today. He had a plan, and he put that plan in place. What if he had been his father's biggest champion? What if he had been the one who was trying to build the coalition there in Israel, trying to bring everybody together? What if he had been the one that was trying to turn the hearts of everybody who came to see the king toward God and God's system of government there? What if he had been the one to say, let's all work together and heal a nation that really did need healing? I mean, they had been through a mess already, and they've got a bunch coming. What if he had chosen to do that? Now, I want you to think just for a minute. Have you ever seen that play out? Maybe not in the church, maybe so. Maybe you've seen it play out at work. Somebody who has tremendous talent, but they go around creating problem after problem after problem. And usually those problems are related to what they want out of the situation. That's just what they do all the time. That happens in the Lord's church. If I were to mention 3 John, what name would you mention back? Diotrephes, yeah. Now there's a fellow who wasn't sitting around doing nothing all day. He was busy, wasn't he? He was active. Now he was destroying the local church. But he had passionate intensity, and he had a plan, and he had an intellect. And what if he had chosen to use that in good ways instead of in negative ways? I just think about that in this section with Absalom, because he has talent, he has ability, and people recognize it, and people respond to him. And he could have done so much to bring all Israel back to the Lord and in subjection to the Lord's anointed King David. He had that opportunity. Yes, sir. Given the current political circumstance that we're in, people don't care, okay? Generally speaking, folks want what they want. And I'm not saying you are like that. I'm not saying we are like that. I'm saying, generally speaking, you let a little time go by, and we tend to forget the bad, and we go back to what we want. That's just how humanity tends to operate. And so, no, they are impressed by Absalom. He's really good looking. We've talked about that. He has a good head of hair, for whatever that's worth to some of you. People like him, and he knows how to get their attention. Look at what it says. He will say, you know, the king doesn't listen to you. Nobody in the king's court, verse 4, is going to listen to you. But I tell you what, I would listen. I would be the one to give you justice. People are coming there to get justice, to have their case heard. I'll give you justice, he says. And then when someone comes near to bow before him, he says, no, that's okay. And he kisses the person. What he's saying is, no, let me pay homage to you. Let me honor you. He knows what he's doing, and he's good at it. And what if he had used that for the Lord's cause and for the cause of his family? It really could have been a marvelous, marvelous thing. You have any thoughts or observations just about that? Is ambition a bad thing?
Not directed the right way.
Yeah, ambition is a God-given thing, isn't it? I mean, that's part of humanity. To one degree or another, we have some kind of ambition within us. It's like asking, is emotion a good thing or a bad thing? Totally depends on what you do with it. That's just the way that is. Emotion is a God-given characteristic of humanity. So what we do with it determines whether or not it is a good thing. Some of us need to work on handling emotion. Some of us need to work on handling ambition. They're not in and of themselves bad. And so it's really good for us to think about using the characteristics, the interests, the passions, the intellect, the intensity that God has given us, using that not just in a not bad way, but using that literally wholly for his cause. You ever known somebody who can talk to anybody, anytime, night or day, about anything? They just know how to do that. They know how to initiate conversation, how to carry on conversation, how to make a conversation work when the rest of us sit there and don't know what to say. They just have a gift. What if that gift is used for the kingdom? Not ancillary in life, not just when I've got nothing else to do, but what if that is my focus? You ever known somebody who is just a caring and kind, generous person? At every turn you want to be around them, because when you leave their presence, you're better than when you got there. There's some folks like that in the world. They're just awesome. The Lord's cause needs people like that. There's some folks whose intellect is beyond many of us. They're just really, really smart people. And they know how to get things done. They know how to use their intellect to accomplish things. What if they use that for the cause of Christ? What if that's their focus? Not something they do on Sundays, but that's the focus of their life. When we start thinking about the various gifts God has given us, we've already mentioned Romans chapter 12, but that is the whole chapter. When we start thinking about the various gifts and abilities and opportunities God has given us, the glaring question for every one of us is not how much do I have, it is how much do I use for his cause. That's why chapter 12 of Romans begins with, you give your body as a living sacrifice. All that there is of you, God has made something of you. He has made you capable in various ways. And what he's saying is, I've made you that way so that you will employ that in my service. He made Absalom to be able to do what Absalom was able to do. But Absalom did not use it appropriately. I think it's a good opportunity for us to think about that and not think in terms of, well, I do more than somebody else. That's not the standard. The standard is, what can I do? We can consider the parable of the talents in that regard. We can go back to our discussion a couple of weeks ago about going the extra mile for the Lord's cause. We know the principles that apply. What am I doing with what God has given me in his kingdom? Anything you want to say about that? Yes, sir. That's what? Yes. Yes.
And that is, often referenced, and that is a good sort of ambition or drive.
Yeah, it can be good. I think about the Apostle Paul telling the Israelites, you have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. That by itself won't get the job done, but the job can't get done without it. So, very good. The kind of zealous for good works, I believe, would be a New King James phrase out of Titus. And so we can think about that and think about how we do with that. Absalom wants folks to like him, doesn't he? Is there anything wrong with that? Not really. I mean, again, it's like the other things we're talking about. It's not wrong to ingratiate yourself to people. Often, doing that and doing that appropriately with the right motive gives you opportunities to teach and to influence. Again, here, bad motive, but nonetheless, that's what he's after. Okay, anything else about verses 1 through 6 and what Absalom is doing here at this moment? Anything else you want to talk about or mention? No? Okay. Well, it comes about at the end of 4 years that Absalom goes to see the king. He goes to see the king, and he says to the king, please let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. Okay, how's the king going to say no to that? He continues, for your servant vowed a vow while I was living at Geshur in Aram, and said, if the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. The king hears that and says, okay, that seems like a good idea. Is that what Absalom's really about? Not at all, no. Absalom has an attitude of, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get what I want. What he ultimately wants is what? He wants to be the king. That's what he's after. And so he's going to lie to the king, and he's going to cheat the king, and he's going to do whatever he can do to displace the king. Who is the king again in his relation, in his family? That's his dad, right? Yeah. He has left where he ought to be, and he is going a direction that has no good end. There is no good end to this situation. Well, we get to meet some other people. Absalom in verse 12, after he gathers up a couple of hundred people to go with him, and there's an interesting point we'll get back to in verse 11, but in verse 12 it says, and Absalom sent for Ahithophel, a Gilonite, David's counselor from his city at Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Now, who is Ahithophel? Have we discussed who he is yet? Does anybody remember who he is?
Saul's household.
Well, let's go back a little bit. Actually, let's go forward. Go to chapter 23. Chapter 23 of 2 Kings. In chapter 23, we have a list. Chapter 23. Yeah, that's Mephibosheth. Yeah. We have a list of folks in chapter 23. Look down at verse 34 with me. You have, in verse 34, you have Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Does anybody remember that name? Go back with me now. Go back with me to chapter 11. Chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. You remember what happens in the first part of chapter 11? We have Bathsheba introduced. Verse 3, so David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? It appears that Bathsheba is the granddaughter of Ahithophel. So how do you think his attitude is generally toward David, more than likely? Probably not real good. Not real good. He knows what all has gone on. He understands everything that has taken place. And so if you're back with me now in chapter 15, I want you to think about Ahithophel and the kind of attitude that he might have, and then understand the context in which his name is mentioned here. Verse 12 again, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Ahithophel is a part of the conspiracy here. And we're going to read a little bit more about him and what he does. He's going to give David some advice. He's going to give Absalom some advice. That advice is going to be terrible, and it's going to lead to more problems. Nonetheless, Ahithophel is introduced to us here. Now, verse 11 is one I want us to think about. Verse 11, then 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited, and went innocently, and they did not know anything. What does that mean? They were not in on the plot when they left Jerusalem. They're moving out with Absalom, and they don't really know why. All they know is, come on, let's go. He didn't give them the whole spiel about his plans and what he was going to do, and they went along with him. Do you learn any lessons from that? Anything you might offer about that? Okay, try to figure out what we're doing. All right, now, sometimes that's easy, sometimes that's difficult. Absalom here, a son of the king, okay, but we know his history, right? We understand what he's been up to, and so there is cause for reasonably us asking some questions. What's really going on here? Where are we going, and what are we going to do? Those are two questions. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, but if he said, Dad said I could go out and do the sacrifice, and so that's what we're going to do.
I totally understand. I totally get. He could have lied to them and most probably did deceive them in getting them to go. The idea that they went innocently means they did not know why they're there. But it does give us an opportunity to talk about the where are we going, what are we doing, and all that kind of thing. And it is really good for us to understand that to the extent that we can understand that. We tell young folks that, don't we? Before you get in the car with somebody, figure out who's there, where you're going, and what you're going to be doing. Right? That's important. You need to know about that. What's going on in that car and what's going on where that car's going. You need to understand all that. Ask some questions. Figure that out. Sometimes folks will lie to you, and you'll have to have an escape hatch for that. I'm pretty sure Absalom did if he were asked. He probably did not tell the whole truth at any given moment, but nonetheless gives us an opportunity to say, okay, there are some folks that are involved in this plot against the king, and they're not aware of what's going on. And we don't want to find ourselves in situations like that. Have you ever been in an arrangement where somebody made a phone call to you or came to see you and was talking to you, and you began to figure out that what they're really trying to do is get you on their side of some particular issue? That's really what they're after. They're trying to gather up some folks to be on their side. We don't want to participate in any of that, whether we're talking about the Lord's church or anything else. That's not the kind of folks we want to be. Now, sometimes that sneaks up on us. And so we need to use opportunities like this to say, I need to be as careful as I can be about all of this and make the very best decisions that I can make. Do you have any comments about that? Anything you want to say? Y'all are not really very talkative this evening. And that didn't change anything either, did it? Yeah, it didn't help one bit. Okay, we'll just move on then. Next thing I want us to look at, if you'll go down with me all the way to verse 30. Verse 30. And David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping as they went. Well, why is David weeping? Why is David so sad? Why have things just absolutely fallen apart? What's got him in that state of mind? Yeah, he has figured it out. He now understands. Word has come to him. He now gets it. It is not that Absalom came to me and subjected himself to me and received a kiss from me because he wanted reconciliation. That is not it. And all of a sudden, David, he gets it. And it is a heartbreaking thing for him. There's no question about that. David was an emotional sort generally, and we have already remarked that that is not a bad thing at all. You can see that in the Psalms, right? You see the emotional side of the personality in the inspired Psalms. And here you can just see him making his way up the Mount of Olives. And he is just in tears because of what has happened. Now, it's really good for us to see that and appreciate that. And it's good for us to understand that our actions, like Absalom's, have an impact on other people. And we might even be able to recognize in our own lives where we have caused someone else that kind of pain and suffering. We might be able to see all of that. And if so, let's learn from it. Let's do better. Let's move on. But the real lesson I want us to get out of this is a connection between what David is doing here in response to his son and how the Lord feels when we reject him, when we refuse to put him first, when we rebel against him and his calls. There is a picture of that in the New Testament in the Gospel of Luke in one of the parables. You know what I'm talking about there? Anybody want to tell me? The prodigal, yeah. The father there represents, well, God himself, and he is there waiting. He is there wanting his son to return. Yeah, but look at what his son, don't care about that. I want my son to return. That's the attitude that God has toward us. And as we see David here, maybe we can pause long enough to think about how our sin, our rejection of God affects him. It most certainly does. Sometimes, though, what Christians will do is we will say, well, I haven't rejected God. Oh, I'm really not as faithful as I could be, I guess. I'm not quite as involved in the Lord's work as I could, but I haven't rejected him. We need to be really honest with ourselves. It is a sentiment of we're either for him or we're against him. We're either all in or we're not in. And that's hard for us to get sometimes. And I understand that presents for us that terribly frightening gray area that we don't want to deal with very often. It is so that each of us is on our own individual spiritual journey, and you may be getting where you need to go faster than I am. I get that. The question is not how do we stack up with one another. The question is, are we doing our best to move in the right direction? And what I find sometimes is I'm just too busy doing other things to be moving in the right direction. I'm not moving in the wrong direction. I'm just not going in the one I need to go in. And I justify that. And I say, yeah, but, I've got a lot going on, fine. Or I'm doing better than so-and-so, which is really easy for us to do because we can always see so-and-so's faults better than our own. So we tend to have those kinds of attitudes towards service to God instead of, like we began this class, all in with every bit of passion and intensity God has given me. Anything less than that causes God some degree of grief, some degree of disappointment. And I don't want to do that. And you don't want to do that. And so maybe we need to get in our minds a very clear picture, verse 30. And David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping as they went. It may be good for us to just think about how our either rebellion, rejection, sin, lack of interest, how that affects our God. I'm not saying that David and the Creator respond identically. I am saying that the Creator is emotionally moved by our rebellion. And sometimes our rebellion comes in a very passive form. It comes in a form that allows me to sit in the church building as if everything's fine, but not at all be intense and passionate about his cause. And I need to be honest with myself about that. Yes, sir.
Marvelous parallel here, and I'm not so sure that this may be the first time the Mount of Olives is mentioned in the text, but you've got that marvelous parallel between David and then the Messiah who will come from his lineage, that as they
Very good. Very good. It is a wonderful thing to see those who are with David understanding David's grief and his agony and participating in it with him. It would be so tempting, and I know this for a fact, it would be so tempting to say, well, you know, you should have seen this coming. Absalom's been a troublemaker since he was a little fellow. We all knew Absalom was going to turn out this way. It would be so tempting to become arrogant about that and to act as if we never have those kinds of issues. It's always Absalom and those kinds of folks. But down deep, we know that's not true. And the people who are with David understand the grief and the agony that he is enduring, and they suffer along with him. And that is a beautiful thing. That is a pattern for us, if you will. Anything else about that before we make one other quick little point? News comes to David in verse 31 that Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. That means something to David, and so his response to that is, "O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness." I love that, because as soon as he figures out that Ahithophel is going to be counseling Absalom, his response isn't, "Oh no, that's terrible, what am I going to do?" His response is, "I'm going to ask the Lord to make that become nothing, to make that just become foolishness." And that's precisely what happens. Ahithophel has an attitude toward David. He conspires with Absalom against the king, the Lord's anointed. And how does it end for Ahithophel? Anybody remember that? How does it end for him? You want to tell us the end? He kills himself. Why is that? Because his advice wasn't taken. He gave some really bad conspiratorial advice to Absalom about how to get back at David, about how to help destroy David. And Absalom did not take his advice, and in his despair, if you go down to verse, where'd it go? Yeah, I lost my place there. 17:23, there you go. It says, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey, arose and went to his home, to his city, and set his house in order and strangled himself. Thus he died and was buried in the grave of his father. The despair of not being able to get back at David by using Absalom, who was using Ahithophel. Any lessons from all of that? Don't get involved in that mess. And don't be a part of the conspiracy. And don't be a part of the revenge. And yes, sir. Okay, that's a really good point that I did not have. That's a really good point. He turns himself to the Lord at that point. Right. Very, very good. Was that the first or the second battle? Okay, very good. Anything else about Ahithophel and his end? I've got some notes about folks who, well, they go the wrong direction. They suffer for it. We're aware of that principle, are we not? Can you give me an example of someone else who went the wrong way and it didn't end well for him? Judas would be one of the prime examples. Okay. Thank you so much for participating. We're going to probably put 16 and 17 together next week if we can pull that off. Thank you so much for participating.